What you are about to witness is not merely a story of war. It is a testament to the unbreakable spirit that resides within those who refuse to surrender, even when the world itself seems to collapse around them. On the waters of the English Channel, beneath the gray skies of June 1944, a sergeant would lose his sight, but discover a vision far greater than any eyes could ever perceive. Stay until the end, for in the darkness of battle, you will find a light that no enemy could extinguish, no wound could diminish, and no fear could overcome. This is the story of a man who proved that true sight comes not from the eyes, but from the unconquerable will of the human soul. The steel hull of the LCVP groaned against the churning waters of the English Channel, each wave striking like the fist of Poseidon himself against the fragile vessel that carried 32 men toward the shores of destiny. Sergeant Marcus Sullivan stood near the bow, his weathered hands gripping the cold metal railing as the salt spray stung his face like needles of ice. Beside him, Corporal Thomas Reed clutched his rifle with trembling fingers, his young eyes betraying the terror that consumed every fiber of his being. The morning of June 6, 1944, had arrived not with the golden light of dawn, but with the gray pallor of death itself stretching across the horizon like a funeral shroud. Over the beaches of Normandy, in war, there is no prize for the runner-up. General George S. Patton. The Channel waters were merciless that morning, waves reaching heights of 4 to 6 feet, sending the landing craft pitching and rolling with such violence that men who had survived years of training found themselves doubled over the gunwales, emptying their stomachs into the dark waters below. The temperature hovered near 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind cut through their uniforms like blades of frozen steel, and the constant spray left every man soaked to the bone, shivering with the cold that seemed to penetrate their very souls. Marcus had been in the army for 12 years, had seen combat in North Africa and Sicily, had watched friends fall and enemies die, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of this moment, for the knowledge that in mere minutes the ramp would drop and eternity would begin. Thomas was 23 years old, fresh from the wheat fields of Kansas, and Marcus could see the fear eating him alive like a cancer of the spirit. The young corporal's lips moved in silent prayer, his rosary beads clicking together beneath his rain-soaked jacket, and Marcus felt the weight of responsibility crushing down upon his shoulders, like an anvil of obligation. These men looked to him for guidance, for strength, for the courage they could not find within themselves, and he knew that in the next hour, many of them would draw their last breath on foreign sand. The engines roared beneath their feet, fighting against the current, pushing them ever closer to the inferno that awaited on those distant beaches, where German machine guns waited like the eyes of death itself. The more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. Richard Marcinko, the sound of artillery began to reach them across the waters, distant thunder that grew louder with each passing second, and Marcus could see the flashes of explosions, illuminating the coastline like hellfire breaking through the morning mist. Omaha Beach lay before them, a crescent of sand that would soon become the most contested ground in human history, where the fate of nations would be decided in blood and sacrifice. The Germans had fortified those cliffs with concrete bunkers, had planted the beaches with obstacles designed to tear landing craft apart, had positioned their MG-42 machine guns in overlapping fields of fire that would create killing zones of mathematical precision. Every man in that boat knew the statistics, knew that the first waves would suffer casualties beyond imagination, but they also knew that failure was not an option, that the liberation of Europe depended on their willingness to walk into the mouth of death itself. Marcus turned to look at his men, memorizing their faces in the gray light of that terrible dawn. There was Private First Class Michael Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, his steady hands now checking his weapon with mechanical precision. There was Sergeant William O'Brien, a red-haired Irishman from Boston who had already survived 3 landings in the Mediterranean, his jaw set with grim determination. And there was Thomas, poor Thomas, whose fear was so palpable that Marcus could almost taste it in the salt air. A young man who had never fired a weapon in anger, who had never seen the light leave another man's eyes, who in the next few minutes would be baptized in the most brutal fire that war could offer. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear. Ambrose Red Moon, the beach was now visible through the spray and smoke, a narrow strip of sand that seemed impossibly far away and terrifyingly close at the same time. Marcus could see the German obstacles jutting from the water like the teeth of some enormous beast, could see the bodies already floating in the surf from the first waves that had gone in ahead of them. The noise was becoming unbearable, a symphony of destruction that filled every corner of existence with its terrible music, and Marcus felt his heart pounding against his ribs, like a prisoner demanding release from its cage of bone and flesh. He thought of his wife Eleanor back in Pennsylvania, of his 2 daughters who barely knew their father, of all the promises he had made and might never keep, and he forced those thoughts down into the depths of his soul where they could not interfere with what must be done. The coxswain shouted something that was lost in the cacophony of war, but Marcus understood the message in the man's eyes, in the way his knuckles whitened on the wheel. 30 seconds. They had 30 seconds before the ramp would drop and eternity would begin. Marcus moved down the line of men, placing his hand on each shoulder, meeting each terrified gaze with eyes that radiated a calm he did not feel but desperately needed to project. He stopped before Thomas, looked into those young eyes that reflected the fires burning on the beach, and spoke words that would echo through the corporal's memory for the rest of his life. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Nelson Mandela listened to me, Thomas, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Fear is not your enemy. Fear is the fire that forges steel. What you do with that fear, that is what defines you. When that ramp drops, you stay behind me, you move when I move, you stop when I stop. We go together, we fight together, and God willing, we survive together. But no matter what happens on that beach, you remember this, you are not alone. You will never be alone. Thomas nodded, something shifting behind his eyes, not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger, something that would be tested in the crucible that awaited them on those bloody sands. The ramp dropped with a metallic scream that signaled the beginning of hell itself. Marcus was moving before his mind could process the decision, his legs carrying him forward into a wall of sound and fury that defied description. The water was chest-deep and cold as death, the current pulling at his legs while bullets stitched the surface around him like rain. From the darkest storm imaginable, men were falling, screaming, dying in those first terrible seconds, their blood painting the waves crimson as the German machine guns found their marks. With mechanical efficiency, Marcus felt something tug at his sleeve, heard the whisper of death passing inches from his ear. But he kept moving, kept pushing forward, kept his eyes fixed on the distant sand that seemed to recede with every step he took toward it. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. Theodore Roosevelt, the mortar round struck the water 15 feet to Marcus's left, the explosion lifting him off his feet and hurling him through the air, like a rag doll caught in a hurricane. Time seemed to stop, to stretch into an eternity of suspended animation, and in that frozen moment Marcus saw everything with perfect clarity, saw the spray of water crystallized in the air, saw the faces of his men contorted in expressions of terror and determination, saw the flash of another explosion blooming on the beach like a flower of destruction. Then time resumed its normal pace, and he was underwater, salt filling his mouth and nose, his body tumbling through the darkness while his lungs screamed for air. He found his footing somehow, broke the surface gasping and choking, and that was when he felt it, the searing agony that exploded through his face like a supernova of pain. His hands went to his eyes instinctively, and they came away covered in blood. So much blood that for a moment he thought he must be dying, must have taken a piece of shrapnel directly to the brain. But he was still standing, still breathing, still alive in this hell of noise and death. And it took him several seconds to understand what had happened, to realize that the darkness engulfing his vision was not the darkness of death, but the darkness of blindness itself. Pain is weakness leaving the body. United States Marine Corps' a piece of shrapnel had torn through his right eye, destroying it completely, and the concussion had damaged the optic nerve of his left, leaving him in a world of impenetrable darkness. Marcus stood there in the churning surf, blood streaming down his face, and for one terrible moment he felt the despair rising up to consume him, felt the overwhelming urge to simply surrender to the waves and let the sea claim him as it was claiming so many others. But then he heard it, cutting through the chaos like a beacon through fog, the voice of Thomas screaming his name. And in that sound Marcus found something that no wound could destroy, no darkness could extinguish. Sergeant Sullivan, Marcus. Thomas's voice was closer now, and Marcus felt hands gripping his shoulders, pulling him forward through the water. "I've got you, Sarge, I've got you. Just keep moving. Keep your feet under you." The fear in Thomas's voice was still there, but it was different now. transformed by necessity into something harder, something more useful. Marcus let himself be guided, his boots finding purchase on the shifting sand beneath the waves, his ears straining to make sense of the symphony of destruction that surrounded them on every side. When you're going through hell, keep going. Winston Churchill. The beach was closer now. Marcus could feel the water growing shallower, could hear the change in the sound of bullets as they transitioned from water impacts to sand impacts around him. Thomas was breathing hard, grunting with effort, and Marcus realized that the young corporal was practically carrying him, was using his own body as a shield against the murderous fire that continued to sweep the beach. "Put me down," Marcus commanded, his voice hoarse but steady. "I can move on my own. Just guide me. Tell me what's ahead." Thomas hesitated, and Marcus could sense the conflict in the younger man, the desire to protect warring with the need to obey. "That's an order, Corporal. We move faster if I'm not dead weight." They emerged from the water together, and Thomas began narrating the nightmare landscape with a clinical precision that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Obstacle 10 meters ahead, check hedgehog, angle left, bodies in the sand, step high. Crater 3 meters, go round right. Shell incoming. They dove together, and Marcus felt the earth shake as another explosion sent debris raining down upon their backs. The sand was cold and wet against his face, the smell of curdite and blood filling his nostrils. And somewhere in the darkness behind his ruined eyes, Marcus Sullivan made a decision that would change everything. The only easy day was yesterday. United States Navy SEALs, he was not going to die on this beach. He was not going to let these men die on this beach. The Germans in those bunkers, with their perfect sight lines and their mathematical killing fields, had made a fundamental error in their calculations. They had assumed that a blind man was a dead man, that a wounded soldier was a liability rather than an asset. They had underestimated the power of the human will to overcome, to adapt, to find strength in the depths of despair that no amount of firepower could match. Marcus rose from the sand, reaching out to grip Thomas's shoulder, and spoke words that would become legend among the men who survived that day. "Listen to me carefully, Thomas. I can't see, but I can hear better than any man on this beach. Every gun has a rhythm, every position has a pattern. You're going to be my eyes, and I'm going to be our ears. Together, we're going to find a way through this hell, and we're going to take as many of our boys with us as we can. Do you understand me?" Thomas's response was immediate. The last vestiges of his paralyzing fear burned away in the crucible of necessity. "I understand. Sergeant, what do you need me to do?" "I will either find a way or make one." Hannibal Barca, what followed was something that defied every principle of military doctrine, every assumption about the limitations of wounded soldiers. Marcus Sullivan, blind and bleeding, began to lead men across that beach of death with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. He could hear the German machine guns, could track their firing patterns by sound alone, could identify the brief moments of silence when the gunners were reloading or transitioning to new targets. "Now, move now, 20 meters forward to the seawall," he would command, and Thomas would guide him while shouting for other soldiers to follow, and somehow, impossibly, they would make it through gaps in the fire that seemed to close behind them like doors slamming shut. Word spread among the survivors huddled behind the seawall. The story of the blind sergeant who could hear death coming and knew how to avoid it. Men who had given up hope found themselves crawling toward Marcus's position, drawn by the impossible tale of a man who had lost his eyes, but found something far more valuable in return. Private Chen was among them, his arm bleeding from a grazed wound, but his spirit intact, his steady hands now serving as additional eyes for the sergeant who refused to die. Sergeant O'Brien appeared from somewhere in the chaos, dragging the wounded privates behind him, his red hair matted with blood and sand, but his Irish fighting spirit burning brighter than ever. "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. Albert Einstein, there's a draw about 50 meters to our right," Thomas reported, his voice now steady as stone. "It leads up to the bluffs. The Germans have a bunker at the top, but if we can get close enough," Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. His head tilted slightly as he listened to something that only he could hear. "There's a mortar team repositioning on the left flank. They'll be operational again in about 90 seconds. That bunker you mentioned, I can hear the rhythm of their gun. They're running low on ammunition. The firing pattern is getting more conservative. If we time this right, if we move when they're changing belts, we can make it to the base of the draw." The men around him exchanged glances of disbelief, but there was something in Marcus's voice, something in the absolute certainty of his bearing that made them believe. David Goggins would one day say that when you think you're done, you're only at 40% of your actual potential. And these men were discovering that truth in the most brutal classroom imaginable. They had thought themselves broken, had believed that death was the only possible outcome. And here was a blind man showing them that the human spirit could transcend any limitation, could overcome any obstacle, could find victory in the jaws of defeat itself, suffer the pain of discipline, or suffer the pain of regret. David Goggins, they moved as one organism. Marcus at the center, with Thomas guiding his every step. The other survivors forming a protective formation around them, while following the blind sergeant's whispered commands. The German bullets continued to rain down, but they seemed to part around this strange unit like water around a stone. And men who should have died found themselves still breathing, still fighting, still moving toward the draw that represented their only hope of reaching the cliffs above. The sand beneath their boots was churned with blood and debris. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying, but Marcus Sullivan heard none of it, heard only the patterns, the rhythms, the mathematical music of war that his extraordinary ears had learned to decode. They reached the draw as the German mortar team Marcus had predicted came back online, shells beginning to fall on the positions they had just vacated. The climb was brutal, the terrain steep and treacherous, and Marcus felt his strength beginning to fail. The blood loss from his wound taking its inevitable toll, but every time he stumbled, there were hands to catch him, voices to encourage him, men who had found their courage through his example and would not let him fall now. Sun Tzu had written that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, but sometimes the supreme art is simply to refuse to be subdued, to keep climbing when every muscle screams for rest, to keep fighting when every rational thought demands surrender. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. Sun Tzu, the German bunker, loomed above them, its concrete wall scarred by naval bombardment, but still intact, still deadly. Marcus could hear the gun crew inside, could hear the clatter of ammunition being loaded, the shouted commands in a language he didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. Grenades, he said quietly. We need grenades at the firing slit. Thomas, describe the bunker to me, every detail you can see. Thomas's description was precise, methodical, and as he spoke, Marcus built a picture in his mind that was somehow clearer than any sight could provide. A three-dimensional map of positions, and angles and possibilities. The assault on the bunker was over in seconds that seemed to stretch into hours. O'Brien and Chen moved on Marcus's commands, their grenades finding the firing slit with an accuracy that bordered on miraculous. And when the survivors poured through the shattered entrance, they found the German crew dead or dying, their weapons silenced forever. Marcus stood in the center of that conquered position, blood still dripping from his face. His empty eye sockets turned toward the sky he could no longer see, and something like peace sailed over his features for the first time since the ramp had dropped. On that LCVP, what seemed like a lifetime ago. The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. Ernest Hemingway below them, on the beach that had consumed so many lives. The tide of battle was beginning to turn. Other units were finding their courage. Other leaders were emerging from the chaos. And the German defenses that had seemed so impenetrable were beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of men who simply refused to accept defeat. Marcus couldn't see any of it, but he could hear it, could feel it in the changing rhythms of the gunfire, in the shifting patterns of explosions, in the growing chorus of American voices shouting commands and encouragement to each other. The enemy had made their mistake, had underestimated not just one blind sergeant, but the indomitable spirit of every man who had crossed that channel and stormed those beaches. Thomas stood beside Marcus as the sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating a beach that was both graveyard and birthplace, a place where so many had died, but where something immortal had also been born. The young corporal, who had trembled with fear in that landing craft, had been transformed by the crucible of combat into something harder, something more resilient, something that would carry the lessons of this day forward into whatever future awaited him. He looked at the blind sergeant who had saved his life, who had saved so many lives, and understood that he had witnessed something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human possibility. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Winston Churchill, the battle for Normandy was far from over. The hedgerows of France awaited, the long bloody march toward Paris and beyond, the countless struggles and sacrifices that would be required before the final victory could be achieved. But on this day, on this beach, something had been proven that no future defeat could ever erase. The human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limits, could find reserves of strength that defied all rational explanation. A man who could not see had led men who could see through the valley of the shadow of death, and they had emerged on the other side with something more valuable than their lives, with proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. Marcus Sullivan would never see the faces of his wife and daughters again, would never watch another sunset over the Pennsylvania hills he called home, would spend the rest of his life in the darkness that had descended upon him on that terrible morning. But he would also spend the rest of his life knowing that he had given everything he had, that he had found within himself a strength he never knew existed, that he had proven the enemy's ultimate mistake. They had looked at a blind man and seen a victim. They should have seen a warrior whose vision extended far beyond the reach of ordinary eyes, a sergeant who understood that true sight comes not from the organs of perception, but from the unconquerable will that refuses to surrender, that refuses to be defeated, that refuses to let the darkness win. It is not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Mark Twain, and so the story continues, not ending but transforming, as all great stories must. The men who survived that day carried pieces of Marcus Sullivan within them, fragments of his courage and determination that would shape their actions for decades to come. Thomas Reed would go on to become a captain, would lead his own men through battles that history has largely forgotten, and in every moment of crisis, he would hear the voice of a blind sergeant telling him that fear is not the enemy, that the darkness is not the end, that the human spirit is capable of achievements that defy all understanding. The beach at Omaha would become sacred ground, a monument to sacrifice and courage. And among the countless stories of heroism that emerged from that terrible day, the legend of the blind sergeant would be whispered from generation to generation, a testament to the truth that Desmond Doss had proven on another battlefield, that the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with, well, I don't stop when I'm tired. I stop when I'm done. David Goggins, you have witnessed a journey through darkness into light, through despair into triumph, through the deepest valleys of human suffering into the highest peaks of human achievement. But this story does not end here, cannot end here, because the spirit that drove Marcus Sullivan across that beach of death lives on in every person who refuses to surrender, who chooses to fight when fighting seems impossible, who discovers that their limitations are merely illusions waiting to be shattered. If you have stayed until this moment, you understand now what the enemy failed to understand then, that the human will, when truly awakened, cannot be defeated by any weapon, cannot be broken by any wound, cannot be extinguished by any darkness. The question now is not what Marcus Sullivan did on that beach in 1944, but what you will do with the fire that his story has ignited within you. The battle continues. The choice is yours. And the enemy's mistake will always be to underestimate those who refuse to be defeated.